What if the midnight hour, that strange in-between time when the world holds its breath, was more than just a trick of darkness? What if, across civilizations, people whispered of spirits who use that hour not for haunting, but for crossing? Not merely to terrify the living, but to step across unseen bridges, to move from one shore of existence to another. The myths of spirits crossing at midnight are not scattered coincidences. They are threads of a story that humanity has been telling itself since the first fires burned in the dark. The dead, we are told, wait for silence, for stillness, for the weight of midnight before they move. In many traditions, midnight is not simply the turning of the clock. It is the witching hour, a window when the veil between worlds thins. The Romans believed the Umbri, the shadows of the dead, wandered more freely after midnight, especially during the festival of Lemuria. To keep them at bay, the living tossed black beans over their shoulders, whispering incantations to appease the restless souls. Yet beneath the fear was a deeper belief. Midnight was the crossing hour. The beans were offerings to the dead on their way, like tolls on a ghostly highway. In Japanese folklore, the concept of yurei, restless spirits, connects midnight with the act of passage. Lanterns would be extinguished, and in that silence, stories say bridges became glowing veins of light that only the spirits could see. They would walk across them, pale forms drifting toward ancestral realms. The living feared to watch, for it was said that if your eyes met theirs, you too would be pulled across. Midnight was not merely night, it was the threshold when pathways unfolded only for the dead. In Celtic belief, the thin places of the world, where one might slip from the mortal realm into the other world, often came alive at midnight. Streams, crossroads, and bridges became doorways. Folklore from Ireland speaks of spectral processions at the darkest hour, souls of the dead marching silently across bridges. They were neither malevolent nor kind. They were simply moving, returning to places they once knew, or heading toward realms that could not be mapped. The living avoided bridges at that time, stepping back from the paths the dead were said to reclaim. The association of midnight with transition may lie in its symbolism. It is the darkest point of the night, when the day has fully died, and yet rebirth is still hidden. Midnight is not yesterday, and it is not tomorrow. It is liminality embodied in time, and so it became the natural hour for spirits, who themselves are neither living nor gone completely, to cross. Just as bridges embody liminality in space, midnight embodies liminality in time. Together they form a cosmic stage where myths of crossing would inevitably be born. Consider the Persian Chinvat Bridge again. Though it is not bound to midnight, Zoroastrian texts describe the soul traveling after 3 nights of death. And when the passage occurs, it is always described as happening in darkness. The bridge is crossed not under the sun, but under the watch of stars. Midnight becomes not just superstition, but a natural alignment of cosmic rhythms. Humanity has always known that darkness is not merely absence of light, it is presence of mystery. Midnight cloaks that mystery in silence. In rural European lore, midnight vigils at bridges were said to invite spirits. Some stories tell of ferrymen who swore they saw ghostly passengers boarding their boats only at midnight, their weightless forms pressing the wood of the vessel without making a sound. By morning, the ferrymen's coins would have vanished, replaced with strange tokens, feathers, stones, or river weeds. Midnight was the only time such trades could occur. The living ferried the dead, not knowingly, but as part of a cycle that turned silently under the moon. Even modern ghost stories carry the weight of this ancient idea. Urban legends across the world speak of vanishing hitchhikers, who appear only at midnight, crossing bridges or roads before dissolving into nothingness. Psychologists might call it projection, but folklore insists otherwise. They are spirits reenacting their final crossing. Midnight binds them, as though the universe itself has written an invisible law. The hour of deepest dark belongs not to the living, but to the travelers caught between worlds. Think, too, of the acoustics of midnight. The world is quietest then, when birds sleep and human footsteps fade. The only sounds are rivers, winds, and the low groan of timbers. For ancient peoples, this stillness was not emptiness, but invitation. It was believed that spirits could hear prayers more clearly at midnight, as though the hush of the world opened a corridor. To stand on a bridge at midnight, whispering into the dark, was to risk being overheard by more than the wind. The silence itself became the road. Cultures in South America speak of the hora muerta, the dead hour. Midnight is when wandering souls leave cemeteries, seeking bridges, thresholds, and doorways to return briefly to places they loved. Families avoided traveling then, fearing to interrupt the crossings, but they also left offerings, water jugs, bread, or candles set near rivers. Midnight became not just the time of fear, but the time of communion. The living acknowledged the journey of the dead, leaving sustenance as one would for a traveler. The paradox of these myths is that they are everywhere, yet each is clothed in its own culture. The Japanese lanterns, the Celtic marches, the Roman beans, the South American offerings. They all describe spirits crossing and always at the same hour. Could it be that midnight has been mythologized because it mirrors death itself? Just as life passes into death through a hidden threshold, so too does day pass into day through a hidden hour. Midnight is death and rebirth written into the sky every 24 hours. Perhaps the most chilling stories come from places where bridges themselves were avoided at midnight. In parts of Eastern Europe, villagers said that if you lingered too long on a bridge after the 12th bell, you would feel a hand grasp your arm, not cold, but weightless, as if smoke had substance. If you pulled away, nothing was there. But if you froze, the hand would guide you gently, step by step, to the edge. Many believed those who drowned at night had not fallen. They had been guided. Midnight was the summons, and the bridge was the stage. But myths do not survive simply because they frighten. They survive because they explain. Midnight became the canvas upon which ancient people painted their deepest questions. Where do we go when we die? Do the dead still walk among us? How do we keep them from becoming trapped, or worse, from returning in anger? Midnight provided the stage. It is no coincidence that countless cultures held funerals, vigils, or prayers that lasted until this hour, waiting for the crossing to be complete. The dead needed their midnight road. In the Himalayas, villagers told stories of spirit lights seen on mountain bridges at midnight. They flickered like torches even when no hand held them. The locals said these were the lamps of ancestors, still walking paths their feet once knew. To encounter one was not a curse, but a reminder. The dead continued their travels, unseen companions on familiar roads. Yet, always, it was midnight that allowed the vision. Only then, when the sky was deepest, did the light appear. Medieval manuscripts record monks warning travelers never to whistle while crossing bridges at midnight. The sound, they said, would summon spirits. Whistling was like calling out a name, and the dead would answer. Entire villages enforced silence at that hour, believing noise could disrupt the fragile crossings underway. Imagine the hush. Rivers flowing, owls hooting, but not a human voice daring to pierce the veil. Midnight was a choreography of silence, designed to let spirits move untroubled. Even in the Americas, indigenous traditions echo the same theme. Among the Navajo, midnight is spoken of as the dark point, a time when the balance between the living and dead tilts. To be awake was dangerous, for you might cross paths with chindi, spirits of the departed who had not moved on. Some elders insisted that one should not stare at bridges, canyons, or rivers at midnight, for these were the highways of spirits. To watch was to risk following them, willingly or unwillingly, into a realm not meant for the living. The science of sleep may even have roots in these myths. Modern psychology speaks of midnight awakenings, those uncanny moments when people stir in the dark, heart pounding with no cause. Ancient cultures did not dismiss these events as random. They called them visitations. They believed the spirit world brushed against the mind more easily then, nudging dreams into visions. The midnight crossing was not only outside, on bridges and roads, but inside, across the fragile bridge of consciousness itself. The connection between bridges and midnight grows even more uncanny when we consider legends of spirit tolls. In Germany, tales told of ghostly figures who demanded payment from travelers crossing bridges at midnight. Not coins of silver, but tokens of memory, stories, songs, or whispered names. The living paid with fragments of themselves, and in return, the spirits allowed safe passage. This ritual echoed an older truth, that crossing is never free. Whether in life or death, one always pays to pass over. And so, midnight became not simply the time of death, but the time of debt. The spirits crossed then because balance was possible. Day and night were split evenly, Silence and sound were balanced. Even fear and hope were entwined. Humanity gave midnight to the dead, and the dead, in turn, gave it back as story, as warning, as myth. Perhaps, then, the myths of spirits crossing at midnight are not stories of fear at all. Perhaps they are acts of remembrance. Midnight, with its silence, with its trembling shadows, is the hour when humanity admits its limits. It is when we remember that we, too, will one day cross. Every bell that strikes 12 is not only a clock, it is a prophecy. It reminds us that we are travelers waiting at the edge of a bridge we cannot yet see. Midnight belongs to the spirits, but in truth, it belongs to us all. So the next time you wake at midnight and feel the silence pressing close, imagine not terror, but procession. Imagine bridges lit with unseen lanterns, pathways glowing faintly, and figures walking steadily, neither rushing nor hesitating. They are not lost, they are crossing. And perhaps, in the corner of your vision, you will glimpse them too, shadows moving with purpose. Do not fear. They are simply travelers on their midnight bridge, stepping into the realm that waits for us all. What if stone bridges, those quiet relics of history, were not only passageways for the living, but traps, places where travelers vanished without a trace? Legends across the world whisper of people who set foot upon such bridges only to dissolve into silence, their footsteps echoing into nothing. They did not fall, nor were they robbed, nor swept away by rivers. They simply ceased to be, as though the bridge itself swallowed them. The stories are chilling, but they are also consistent, weaving together accounts from Europe, Asia, the Americas, and beyond. If so many people, across so many centuries, believed in the vanishing of travelers on stone bridges, perhaps it is not superstition at all, but memory, an echo of something real. Consider the medieval chronicles of Europe. In regions of France and Wales, stories tell of shepherds who crossed old bridges with their flocks at dusk, only for the animals to return alone. Neighbors would search, but no trace of the man was ever found, and priests declared it a punishment for working on holy days, while villagers whispered that the bridges had claimed another soul. These vanishings were treated not as crimes, but as sacrifices demanded by structures too ancient to be ordinary. The bridge was no mere span of stone. It was an altar, always hungry. In Japan, tales of vanished travelers are tied to bridges near sacred shrines. Monks wrote of pilgrims disappearing mid-crossing, lanterns falling into rivers while their carriers never emerged on the opposite bank. These places were marked as haunted, avoided at night. Yet the locals did not always fear them. They left offerings, believing the vanished had been taken to serve ancestors in the unseen realm. A disappearance was not death. It was a calling. The bridge, they believed, chose who would remain and who would move on. Across the Scottish Highlands, bridges were believed to be liminal traps. Stories tell of riders on horseback who began their journey across but never reached the far side. In some versions, only the horse was found, trembling and foam-mouthed, reins dragging in the water. The rider had gone. These tales blurred into folklore of fairy abductions, of the sea claiming mortals who wandered too close to their crossings. Stone bridges became thresholds, places where a single step could shift the traveler into a world not meant for human eyes. Such myths were not confined to Europe or Asia. Among Native American traditions, bridges of stone and wood were thought to be watched by spirits of rivers. Some tribes spoke of people vanishing while carrying goods across, their baskets later discovered neatly placed at the bridge's edge. The explanation was simple. The river spirits had reclaimed what was theirs. The vanished were not seen as victims, but as chosen ones, drawn into the eternal flow of water. To walk a bridge was to gamble with forces much older than human settlements. Psychologically, vanishings at bridges carry another meaning. The human mind finds thresholds unsettling because they blur categories. Neither land nor water, neither here nor there. To vanish on a bridge is the ultimate embodiment of that fear. Being lost not in one world nor the other, but in the gap between. Folklore gives language to this anxiety, and bridges become characters in the story, hungry mouths of stone that take what they need to keep balance. Every missing traveler is a reminder. The path you walk may not return you. In Eastern Europe, ballads recount lovers who vanish together while meeting at midnight upon bridges. The stories claim they do not die, but slip into another world where their love may continue without persecution. For peasants under oppressive regimes, these tales were less horror than hope. Bridges became not only places of loss, but of escape, thresholds where ordinary rules of life and authority no longer applied. To vanish was to be free. To vanish was to live elsewhere. The bridge was both predator and liberator. Even modern history holds reports that echo these myths. Rural newspapers from the 19th century describe individuals last seen stepping onto covered bridges, their lanterns visible before both person and light blinked out. Searchers combed rivers and forests, but found nothing. In some accounts, shoes or cloaks were discovered neatly folded at the far side, as though the traveler had crossed into something unseen. Skeptics blamed criminals or accidents, yet the details repeated across continents. Stone bridges marked disappearances with an eerie regularity. The question is not whether vanishings occurred, but why so many cultures framed them around bridges. Perhaps it was coincidence, but more likely it was archetype. The bridge is liminal, unstable, both safe and dangerous. To step upon it is to risk exposure to forces that thrive in thresholds. Vanishings became inevitable in the imagination of the collective mind. And so, when real disappearances occurred, by accident, by murder, by natural disaster, they were absorbed into the deeper myth that the bridge hungered. Think of the emotional intensity of such stories. A family watches their father walk onto a bridge at dusk, lantern swinging. They expect him to appear on the far side. He never does. The silence stretches, the light fades, and soon they are screaming his name into the water. But there is no splash, no cry, no clue. The bridge stands as it always has, indifferent. To them, the structure itself becomes complicit, its stones holding secrets tighter than any thief. The bridge is no longer just stone, it is an accomplice to fate. In India, colonial travelers wrote of villagers who avoided certain bridges entirely. They claimed people disappeared not into rivers, but into time. Elders warned that stepping onto those bridges after dark could transport one into the past or into the land of the dead. Those who vanished might not be gone forever. They might still be walking, unseen, on another plane. Travelers who risked these places often left offerings of flowers, rice, or coins before crossing. The gesture was less protection than acknowledgement. The bridge had power and must be paid. The persistence of these stories suggests a profound human need to explain the unexplainable. People vanish in rivers, in forests, in deserts. But when they vanish on bridges, the symbolism is too powerful to ignore. The bridge is the perfect metaphor for the act of disappearing, the space between one state and another. A traveler who vanishes there becomes part of the myth, their absence echoing louder than their life ever could. The stone bridge becomes a storyteller, its arches whispering of those who never returned. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is that even today, many claim to feel something uncanny on old stone bridges. Travelers describe sudden chills, dizziness, or the sensation of being watched. Some say they feel pulled, as though gravity itself shifts. Could it be that the myths linger not because of old stories, but because the bridges still exert some presence? Whether psychological, architectural, or supernatural, the experience repeats. Bridges unsettle us, and in that unsettlement lies the seed of vanishing. But legends rarely survive on mere fear alone. They endure because they touch something universal. The fear of vanishing while in motion, of stepping forward and never reaching the other side, is older than history. Bridges embody that terror perfectly. They are narrow, suspended, fragile. One moment you are here, the next you are gone. No battlefield or forest carries this symbolism so strongly. And so, stories of disappearances on bridges multiplied, not as entertainment, but as warnings passed from parent to child. In the folklore of the Balkans, bridges demanded sacrifices during construction. Legends claim that a life had to be entombed within the foundations. Otherwise, the bridge would collapse. Builders sometimes lured or tricked people into the masonry, sealing them alive. Over centuries, villagers whispered that the reason travelers vanished later was because the bridge continued to take payment. The stone remembered its first sacrifice and demanded more. Every vanishing was the bridge feeding itself, keeping its arches strong with unseen lives. Chinese folklore tells of bridges haunted by fox spirits or hungry ghosts who lure travelers off the path at night. To walk across such bridges was to risk illusion, lights in the mist, voices calling your name. Those who followed vanished forever, lost in realms that mirrored the living but never returned. Stone bridges in particular were said to hold this danger, their permanence mistaken as safety when in truth it made them eternal doorways. In South America, the Quechua people told of echo bridges, where those who vanished were said to still call back faintly, voices trapped in the arches. Locals avoided shouting near such bridges, believing every echo was the cry of someone taken. To hear your own voice return too closely was a bad omen, a warning that you might be next. The soundscape of stone amplified not only footsteps, but myths, making absence tangible in every reverberation. The Middle East, too, carries stories of disappearance. Caravan travelers crossing narrow stone spans and desert ravines spoke of companions who walked ahead and were never seen again. The dust bore no footprints beyond the midpoint. Some said the jinn took them, pulling them sideways into unseen realms. Others swore the bridges were bargains between humans and spirits, contracts that demanded a life from time to time. The desert winds carried these tales far, blending absence into folklore until stone bridges themselves seemed alive with hunger. In literature, the motif of vanishing on bridges carried into Gothic novels and modern horror alike. Writers described bridges as hungry mouths or stone coffins, devouring those bold enough to test them. These stories were not invented in isolation. They drew upon centuries of whispers, each retelling layering new fear upon old memory. By the time the printing press spread, the legend was already fixed. To vanish on a bridge was to vanish completely, as though erased by fate itself. Yet, the persistence of such myths raises a haunting possibility. What if vanishings were not only stories, but real anomalies? History is littered with unsolved disappearances. When they occurred near rivers or mountains, they were tragedies. But when they occurred on bridges, they were mysteries. Police reports spoke of last sightings at the edge of bridges, of lanterns found abandoned, of horses returning without riders. These were recorded facts, not fairy tales. Perhaps the myth survived because something truly did happen there, again and again. And here lies the deeper truth. Bridges symbolize transition, and transitions always risk loss. To step onto a stone bridge is to surrender the solid ground you know for the uncertainty of suspension. The myths of vanishings are humanity's way of acknowledging the peril hidden in every transition, between childhood and adulthood, safety and danger, life and death. The bridge becomes more than architecture. It becomes destiny carved in stone. Travelers vanish not because the structure demands it, but because the human soul recognizes how fragile every crossing is. Imagine standing on a ruined bridge at twilight. The stones are cracked, moss covers the railings, and the water below churns endlessly. You place a hand on the ancient surface and wonder how many feet crossed here, and how many never reached the far side. In that moment, you feel the weight of absence. The myths breathe against your skin, whispering that the bridge is not inert. It is alive with memory. You feel a chill not from the wind, but from the thought that perhaps, if you took one more step, you would never arrive. And so, the stories endure. From France to Japan, from the Andes to the Himalayas, bridges hold the same reputation. They are more than stone. They are mouths that consume, gates that select, thresholds that demand. Travelers vanishing while on stone bridges are not merely accidents or crimes. They are echoes of humanity's oldest fear, that in crossing we might not arrive. And maybe, just maybe, those who vanished did not disappear at all. Perhaps they are still walking, forever caught in the middle, trapped between shores, unseen companions on every bridge we cross. What if some of the world's most ancient bridges were not answers to geography, but to mystery? What if their arches and spans were laid carefully over valleys where no water flowed, over flatlands where no river cut a path, over stretches of earth that never demanded such structures at all? Archaeologists have puzzled over this for centuries, bridges standing in places where no crossing was ever needed. To dismiss them as errors of ancient builders is to underestimate the deliberate, almost sacred intention of those who carved and placed every stone. A bridge with no river is more than a puzzle. It is a message. Imagine walking in the hills of Central Asia and discovering a perfectly built stone bridge arching over dry ground. Beneath it is no river, no seasonal stream, no hint of water erosion in the soil. Villagers shrug when asked. They say the bridge has always been there. Some whisper that it was built for processions of the dead, not for carts of the living. Others say it was laid as an imitation, a rehearsal of the great bridge souls must one day cross. Whatever the reason, the emptiness beneath its arch feels deliberate, as though silence itself was the element it was designed to span. Across Europe, similar structures exist. In rural Italy, stone bridges rise across small gullies that could have been crossed on foot. Why the labor of quarrying stone, aligning arches, and laying pathways for such insignificant spans? Some researchers suggest these bridges were never about geography, but ritual. Villagers may have carried their dead across them, symbolically moving from the land of the living into the land of ancestors. The absence of water was not a flaw. It was a statement. The bridge was a stage for ceremony, a portal disguised as infrastructure. In India, ancient dry bridges appear in sacred landscapes, often aligned with temples or pilgrimage routes. Pilgrims walked across these spans not to reach the other side, but to enact the crossing of spirit into devotion. No river was required because the crossing was not physical, it was metaphysical. Every stone, every joint, every echo of footsteps was a ritual reminder that life itself is a bridge, and walking across is an act of surrender to forces larger than oneself. These dry bridges are sermons in stone, still preaching silently centuries later. Anthropologists studying Andean ruins discovered bridges built across rocky plains, their purpose unclear. The locals say they are soul bridges, raised during festivals when effigies of the dead were carried from village to village. The bridges may have been symbolic staging grounds, where the effigies stopped, paused, and were lifted across nothingness. In this way, the community rehearsed the unseen river of death. To outsiders, it looked absurd. To the people who built them, it was essential. The bridge was not about distance, it was about destiny. The psychological impact of a bridge with no river is profound. To cross such a structure is to perform a ritual act, even if unintentional. You step onto stone, knowing it leads nowhere necessary. Your mind begins to search for meaning. Why here? Why this labor? The absence beneath the bridge becomes louder than the water that is missing. It demands an answer, and myth supplies one. The ancients, we realize, may not have been engineers in the modern sense. They were myth makers in stone. Some legends go further. In Eastern Europe, bridges were said to be built where rivers once flowed, but had dried up because the dead drank them dry. The bridges remained as monuments, reminders of crossings long past. Villagers claimed that at midnight, if you lay beneath the bridge, you could hear the rush of phantom water, echoing from another world. The absence of a river was not proof of uselessness. It was evidence of mystery. The bridge remained because its purpose was not bound to geography, but to the spirit. In China, scholars uncovered stone footbridges in regions where records show no major rivers ever existed. Some aligned with celestial patterns, pointing towards solstice sunsets or lunar rises. They were not functional crossings at all, but observatories of the spirit. The bridges marked cosmic paths, mirroring the journey of souls across the heavens. The dry earth beneath was irrelevant. The sky above was the true river, and the bridge was its reflection. The Middle East, too, carries strange tales of bridges across deserts, their spans arching over sand, as though anticipating floods that never came. Bedouin lore holds that these bridges were guest bridges, places where spirits traveling with caravans were honored. Offerings were left at their center, water poured into the sand as libation. To build a bridge in the desert was not madness, it was devotion. It was saying to the unseen, "We recognize your journey, though we cannot see it." And what of the Americas, where pre-Columbian peoples carved bridges of stone and rope across flat ravines with no flowing water? Archaeologists once dismissed them as practice constructions, attempts to test engineering before spanning rivers. But local traditions insist otherwise. They were ceremonial, built to honor gods of thresholds and pathways. Communities walked across them in festivals, chanting, beating drums, carrying effigies of ancestors. The bridges did not connect two pieces of land. They connected two pieces of existence. The symbolism of such bridges is staggering. They are monuments to the human need to ritualize transition. To build a bridge where no river flows is to declare that crossing itself matters more than what is crossed. It is to enshrine liminality as sacred. These bridges tell us that our ancestors were not merely practical builders. They were philosophers, ritualists, cosmologists. They understood that the deepest rivers are invisible, and the most important crossings happen in silence, upon dry ground. But the enigma deepens when we examine the sheer labor involved. Stone bridges are not light constructions. They require immense resources, manpower, and precision. Why would ancient communities invest so heavily in building across spaces that needed no crossing? The answer may lie in their cosmologies. For them, the unseen was as real as the seen. A river of souls, an invisible stream of spirits, was no less demanding of respect than a rushing flood. To build a bridge over emptiness was to sanctify that unseen river, to acknowledge its presence in stone. In folklore of the Balkans, bridges over dry gullies were said to be ghost aqueducts. They carried not water, but spirits. Locals swore that on certain nights you could see pale forms drifting beneath the arches, moving as though borne by currents. Children were forbidden from lingering there after dusk, not for fear of drowning, but for fear of being swept up by the invisible flood. The bridge, they said, remembered the river even if the earth forgot. Mesoamerican traditions also speak of dry bridges. Some Mayan sites contain stone spans over shallow depressions, too insignificant to justify such structures. Researchers now believe they may have served as ritual bridges, crossed during funerary ceremonies. Shamans led processions of mourners across these spans, chanting to guide the dead into the underworld. The absence of water beneath symbolized the void between life and death, the chasm every soul must cross. Nor was this idea unique to the Americas. In Japan, Shinto shrines often feature arched bridges over dry ground or ponds deliberately left empty. These bridges, painted bright vermilion, symbolize the transition from the mundane world into the sacred precinct. Pilgrims bow before crossing, acknowledging that the bridge is not over water, but over impurity itself. The emptiness is intentional. It declares that crossing is holy, regardless of what lies beneath. The psychology of such architecture is profound. Human beings are drawn to patterns, to purposes. A bridge with no river unsettles us, demanding explanation. It suggests a secret we are not privy to, a logic beyond utility. This dissonance provokes myth. Stories of spirits, gods, and vanished waters bloom in the vacuum of reason. The bridge becomes a canvas for imagination, a symbol of unseen realities. Modern archaeologists often struggle with these structures, attempting to rationalize them as remnants of dried rivers or shifts in geography. But sometimes geological evidence contradicts this. There was never a river, never a floodplain, never even seasonal runoff. The builders placed a bridge where the land itself never demanded one. In those cases, myth seems more reasonable than engineering. The bridge was not for Earth, it was for the soul. Stories from North Africa speak of sky bridges built across desert wadis that never filled with water. Nomadic tribes believed these structures mirrored constellations. By aligning the arches with star patterns, they created pathways on the ground that echoed the heavens above. To walk across was to join the stars, to step into cosmic alignment. The dry earth beneath was irrelevant. What mattered was the bridge between the human and the divine. And in Eastern Europe, folklore insists that some dry bridges were built as bargains with the dead. Communities believed restless spirits demanded roads of their own. And so, masons built bridges where no rivers flowed to appease them. To cross these bridges was to pay homage, to acknowledge the invisible population that lived alongside the living. Refusing to build them, villagers said, brought drought, sickness, or misfortune. The bridge was both offering and protection. Even in modern times, remnants of this tradition linger. Some villages in the Mediterranean hold processions, where participants walk across dry bridges carrying effigies or icons. No water flows beneath, yet the symbolism is intact. The act is not about geography, but memory. Every step echoes ancient ritual crossings, reminding participants that life itself is a passage, that emptiness is not absence but potential. The more we look, the clearer the pattern becomes. Bridges built where no river once flowed are not mistakes of history. They are testaments to humanity's obsession with thresholds, with the act of crossing itself. They prove that our ancestors valued the symbolic as much as the practical, that they carved stone not only for survival, but for meaning. Perhaps, in the end, the greatest river is time, These dry bridges span centuries, carrying stories from builders long gone to travelers who stumble across them today. The earth beneath may be dry, but the current they cross is eternal. And as you step onto such a bridge, you may feel it, the pull of something unseen, the whisper of a crossing still underway. To walk off the far side is to understand that absence itself can be sacred. The bridge endures not because it was needed, but because it was believed. And belief, carved into stone, becomes stronger than any river. What if beneath the stones of ancient bridges lay not only mortar and rock, but the whispers of ritual offerings, tokens, sacrifices, and prayers buried in their foundations? Across cultures, the act of building a bridge was never merely technical. It was sacred. To bind stone to stone across a void, to dare to cross what nature had divided, was to interfere with forces beyond human control. And so, builders sought protection. They buried offerings into the foundations, feeding the structure with symbols of faith and fear, ensuring its survival not only through physics, but through ritual. Legends across Europe speak of coins, bones, and even entire animals placed beneath the first stones of bridges. In Romania, folk memory recalls that blood sacrifices were once demanded. A rooster, a lamb, or in darker tales, even a human life sealed within the foundation. The belief was that the bridge would collapse unless it was given something living to hold it up. The structure needed a soul, a guardian, a tether to the other world. Every offering, whether blood or gold, was meant to transform a fragile span into an eternal one. In Japan, records from the Edo period describe workers burying dolls, charms, and ritual scrolls beneath wooden and stone bridges. These objects, known as hitogata, were substitutes for human sacrifice, shaped like people, infused with prayers, placed beneath the pilings so the bridge might carry not only weight but blessing. Travelers believed the spirits of these offerings guided them safely across. To cross a bridge without such protections was to tempt disaster, as though the structure might rise up in protest, demanding the life it had been denied. In India, offerings of rice, flowers, and milk were poured into the soil beneath bridge foundations during construction. Hindu rituals demanded propitiation of river deities, who were thought to resent human attempts to tame their flow. By burying offerings, builders sought to pacify the waters and ensure the bridge stood firm. Yet archaeologists have also discovered stranger items, figurines of gods, inscribed stones, and fragments of ash, suggesting funerary connections. The bridge was not merely about trade or travel. It was also about the journey of souls. The Balkans tell some of the most haunting stories. Folklore speaks of masons sealing people alive into bridge walls. The tale of the Bridge of Arta in Greece is perhaps the most famous. Every day, the structure collapsed until a human life was offered into its stones. The legend insists that the chief mason's own wife was buried alive, her spirit crying out even now from the walls. Though historians debate the literal truth, the myth reveals a symbolic conviction that a bridge demanded more than labor, that it needed life itself to stand. In China, archaeologists excavating ancient bridges have found caches of coins, jade ornaments, and ceramic vessels buried at their bases. These were not random treasures, but intentional deposits, left as gifts to river spirits. To the builders, the bridge was a bargain. In exchange for safe passage, the structure itself carried wealth into the earth. Every traveler who crossed afterward benefited from that original pact. The buried offerings made the bridge more than engineering. They made it a temple of stone. Among the Norse, bridge building intersected with myth. The Rainbow Bridge Bifrost connected the human world with the realm of the gods. When real bridges were built, sagas suggest that animals, particularly horses, were buried near the piers as sacrifices. Their spirits were thought to carry travelers across safely, echoing the gods' own journeys. To find the bones of horses beneath an old bridge was not an anomaly, but proof of ancient belief. Fossilized ritual still holding the stones together. In the Andes, llamas were sacrificed at bridge sites, their blood poured into the earth before the first stones were placed. In some excavations, archaeologists found charred remains of offerings sealed in clay vessels beneath the foundations. The bridge was not seen as stone alone, but as a living entity requiring sustenance. Its endurance was a partnership between human craft and divine appeasement, fed by sacrifice. But not all offerings were so literal. In some cultures, builders buried songs. Scrolls, prayers, or carved inscriptions were sealed into stone boxes, hidden deep within the structure. These were voices preserved for eternity, meant to echo silently every time a traveler set foot on the bridge. Though unseen, the offerings resonated through the very arches, invisible guardians of passage. The psychology of burying offerings reveals a profound truth. People feared bridges. To step onto a span was to place trust in stones suspended over voids. That trust required more than calculation. It required faith. Offerings and foundations were contracts, affirmations that the human act of crossing aligned with the divine order. Without them, the bridge felt vulnerable, incomplete, unsafe. Even today, remnants of this tradition survive. In parts of rural Asia, coins are still thrown into the base of new bridges. In Europe, ribbons and locks are tied to beams before construction is completed. These are echoes of ancient offerings, gestures that admit what our ancestors knew well. Bridges are not just stone, they are thresholds, and thresholds demand tribute. Consider the way these offerings bound communities together. Building a bridge was never just construction, it was communal ritual. Every coin buried, every animal sacrificed, every whispered prayer folded into the soil was a collective declaration. We will cross together. The bridge embodied not only stone and span, but the shared hopes and fears of those who laid its foundation. Each buried offering was both gift and anchor, rooting the community's faith into the earth as deeply as the stones themselves. In Eastern Europe, a chilling variation of these legends speaks of children buried within bridge foundations. Folklore claims that their laughter was heard in the arches, a spectral song that gave the structure life. Historians argue these are symbolic myths, metaphors for the child of the community being given to secure the bridge's future. Yet the persistence of such stories reveals the depth of belief. Only life itself could secure passage across voids. The bridge was not a machine, it was a shrine demanding sacrifice. In Africa, rituals surrounding bridges often involved pouring libations of blood or palm wine into the earth at the moment of laying the first stones. These offerings acknowledged river spirits and sought their cooperation. Without such rituals, elders warned, the bridge would not stand. Oral traditions even suggest that bridges without offerings were avoided entirely, labeled cursed or incomplete. Communities knew instinctively that something essential had been left undone. In South America, excavations at Inca bridge sites uncovered miniature figurines of gold and silver buried beneath pylons. These were offerings to Inti, the sun god, and to Pachamama, the earth mother. The bridge was framed as a collaboration between celestial and terrestrial powers, binding sky, earth, and human will. Every traveler who crossed became part of that alliance, whether they knew it or not. The offerings buried below ensured the safety of their steps above. Chinese legends extend the practice further. Some bridges were said to contain sealed boxes of written curses, directed not at people, but at disasters. The text commanded floods to stay away, commanded storms to turn aside. In effect, the offerings were not gifts, but negotiations, agreements inscribed in language and bound into stone. The bridge was not only protected by faith, but by law, the law of ritual inscribed at its core. Even in the Middle East, traditions describe builders offering hair, milk, or even drops of their own blood into the mortar. To mix body with stone was to ensure the builder's spirit lingered as guardian. The bridge thus became an extension of human identity, infused with fragments of life itself. Crossing it meant walking across not only stone, but the preserved essence of those who built it. Modern parallels abound. We still bury offerings in concrete pillars, though we call them time capsules. Coins from the year of construction, newspapers, photographs, all sealed away in foundations as symbols of continuity. Though we may not admit it, the instinct is the same, to feed the structure with memory, to give it something invisible to hold. Bridges are not complete until they carry stories within their bones. Perhaps the most unsettling implication of these buried offerings is that they blur the line between life and death, between sacrifice and survival. To bury blood, bone, or memory beneath a bridge is to acknowledge that crossing is never free. It costs something, always. The offerings remind us that every safe passage is purchased, whether in gold, grain, or grief. Archaeologists continue to uncover these mysteries. Coins gleam in forgotten soil. Animal bones rest in foundation pits. Charred vessels speak of fire and ritual. Each discovery is a reminder that bridges were never neutral. They were contested ground between human ambition and divine authority, places where sacrifices had to be made so that stone could defy water, gravity, and time. And so, when you walk across an ancient bridge, consider what lies beneath. Perhaps beneath your feet are offerings sealed away centuries ago, still whispering their prayers. Perhaps every safe crossing you make is not your own achievement, but a gift from those who gave before you. Perhaps the true foundation of the bridge is not stone at all, but sacrifice. To cross such a bridge is to step upon history's altar. The offerings beneath it hold you, carry you, and remind you that nothing enduring is built without cost. The bridge spans more than space. It spans the gulf between the living and the dead, between hope and fear, between the offerings buried in silence and the footsteps echoing above. What if bridges, those mighty arches of stone and wood, did not fall only to time or storm, but to words? What if whispers, chants, and prayers spoken at the right hour could bring entire spans tumbling into rivers below? Myths from around the world suggest exactly this, that bridges were not only feats of engineering, but vessels of spirit, bound by ritual and undone by ritual. The collapse of a bridge after a prayer was not an accident. It was destiny summoned by the tongue. In the Balkans, tales survive of bridges that fell only after incantations were spoken. One story tells of masons who, knowing their work was cursed, left behind secret prayers. Villagers who recited these words aloud could cause the bridge to crumble, stone by stone. The structure itself was alive, held together not only by mortar, but by silence. To break that silence with the forbidden prayer was to unbind its soul. The people believed that words could undo what hands had made. In Japan, Buddhist monks told of death prayers used to dismantle bridges that spirits had claimed. When certain sutras were recited on the banks at midnight, the wood and stone would tremble, collapsing into rivers. To the monks, this was purification, the destruction of bridges thought to attract demons. They were never ordinary prayers, but sacred recitations designed to command the unseen. The collapse was not destruction, but exorcism. European folklore carries similar tales. In Wales, the so-called Devil's Bridges were said to fall when holy prayers were spoken at their center. These bridges were believed to have been built with infernal aid, bargains struck between desperate villagers and dark forces. To prey upon them was to revoke the contract, to undo the unholy pact. The collapse of the bridge was terrifying, but it was also liberation, the earth reclaiming what had been stolen by the devil's craft. In the Middle East, legends tell of Sufi mystics who could bring down bridges through whispered invocations. These stories framed bridges as proud works of kings who had not sought divine approval. When arrogance offended the heavens, mystics were said to kneel at the piers and pray. The next morning, the bridge lay in ruins, as though the stones themselves had listened. It was not sabotage, it was judgment. In South America, Incan lore speaks of rope bridges collapsing during rituals of renewal. When elders prayed for the old to give way to the new, the ropes would be cut as offerings. Yet some stories say the bridges fell on their own, as though obeying prayers uttered beneath the stars. The fall was seen as sacrifice, the bridge giving its life so another could be born. Travelers mourned not the destruction, but the passing of a spirit that had served faithfully. The psychological power of these tales lies in their fusion of fragility and reverence. Bridges, no matter how strong, are always precarious, suspended above voids, rivers, or chasms. To imagine that words could undo them is to confront the raw truth. They are not eternal. The prayer becomes a symbol of inevitability, the collapse a reminder that nothing man builds is beyond the reach of fate. Archaeological evidence hints at ritual collapses too. Some ancient bridges show signs not of gradual decay, but of deliberate dismantling. Stones removed systematically, wood burned ritually. Inscriptions nearby describe ceremonies, offerings, even chants meant to release the bridge. These collapses were not failures of engineering, but intentional endings, ushered in with prayer. The myths converge on one unsettling truth. Bridges were not merely built. They were born, sustained, and sometimes put to death. Just as offerings buried in their foundations gave them life, prayers spoken at the right hour could end that life. A bridge was never just stone, it was spirit. And like any living thing, it could be killed. But the legends grow stranger when we explore their symbolic dimension. Prayers, after all, are not just words, they are intentions made audible, forces unleashed through breath and belief. To pray against a bridge was to declare its time over, to release it from its burden. In some traditions, communities would gather when a bridge was old or cursed and recite prayers together, their voices rising in unison until the structure gave way. The collapse was not seen as disaster, but as ritual fulfillment. In Eastern Europe, ballads describe widows who cursed bridges where their husbands drowned. Standing at twilight, they prayed for the arches to fall so no other soul would be taken. In many tales, the bridges obeyed, tumbling into rivers within days. The collapse was framed not as coincidence, but as compassion, the stones themselves listening to grief and yielding to protect future travelers. In India, stories link collapsing bridges to prayers made during monsoon rituals. Villagers believed that chanting at riverbanks could summon floods, and that bridges standing in defiance of the waters would fall. The collapse was interpreted as harmony restored, a reminder that human structures could never outweigh the will of rivers. The prayers were not curses, but acknowledgments, aligning human voices with nature's voice. Consider too the Norse sagas, where bridges were both literal and mythic. The Rainbow Bridge Bifrost was prophesied to shatter during Ragnarok, collapsing as gods and giants clashed. Scholars suggest that rituals echoing this myth may have included prayers to symbolically break bridges, acting out cosmic cycles. To destroy a bridge in prayer was to participate in the rhythm of creation and destruction that bound the universe. China's Taoist traditions carry similar echoes. Some bridges were consecrated with prayers that set time limits on their existence. When that limit was reached, priests returned to recite words that released the bridge's spirit, after which it was left to decay. The collapse was expected, even welcomed, as part of the natural cycle of death and renewal. A bridge without such prayers was thought to linger unnaturally, becoming haunted or cursed. Even Christianity carried fragments of this belief. Medieval monks wrote of bridges collapsing when sacred psalms were sung against them, particularly if the bridge had been built without blessing. Priests sometimes led processions to pray over dangerous or unholy bridges, and stories claim that some crumbled underfoot as hymns echoed. These collapses were framed as triumphs of divine will over human arrogance. Archaeologists studying ruins in Central Asia discovered inscriptions suggesting that bridges were ritually killed. The prayers recorded spoke of returning the stones to the earth, thanking the spirits for their service, and releasing the structure from obligation. Collapses were not failures, but orchestrated endings, guided by prayerful hands and voices. The symbolism is powerful. To pray a bridge into collapse is to remind the living that thresholds are temporary. Every crossing has an end, every structure a lifespan. Prayers acknowledge that bridges, like people, are born, live, and die. By collapsing them ritually, communities gave them death rites, ensuring they did not linger as restless spirits. Modern echoes of these beliefs still linger. In some rural places, people mutter prayers or curses before demolitions, as though words hasten stone to yield. Engineers may dismiss this as superstition, but workers often report uncanny sensations when structures fall exactly after such rituals. The ancient connection between word and collapse has not entirely vanished. Perhaps the most haunting implication of these stories is this: that sound itself, prayer itself, can move stone. Whether by divine intervention, collective will, or psychological resonance, people believed words had power not just over minds, but over matter. Bridges collapsing after prayers remind us that structures are more than physics. They are contracts with the unseen. To speak against them is to unmake them. But if bridges truly collapsed after prayers, what does this say about the relationship between humanity and its own creations? It suggests that no structure is fully ours. Every span of stone is a negotiation between human ambition and forces larger than ourselves. To build is bold, but to unbuild with words is humbling. These stories reveal that bridges were never trusted completely. They were honored, feared, and sometimes dismissed, with prayers that sent them back into the earth. Folklore from the Caucasus tells of warriors who, After battles, prayed for bridges to fall so enemies could not pursue. Sometimes the bridges collapsed immediately, other times within days. Whether fact or legend, these tales show that communities believed prayer could shape fate directly. The bridge was not merely an object of stone, it was a participant in conflict, listening and responding. In the Americas, some native traditions describe bridges made of wood or rope deliberately collapsed after songs of release. Elders sang to the spirits of rivers, asking them to reclaim what had been borrowed. The bridges fell gracefully, as if obeying the music. These collapses were not disasters, but ceremonies, gestures of respect to natural cycles. The pattern across cultures is striking. Words built bridges as much as stone, and words could also dismantle them. Prayers were the tools of creation and destruction, as binding as mortar. When spoken in reverence, they raised arches. When spoken in dismissal, they toppled them. Imagine standing on an ancient bridge at dusk, knowing that somewhere in its history, voices had once called for its fall. You look at the stones beneath your feet and wonder, what words still sleep there, waiting to be awakened? What prayers might still unmake the very path you trust to carry you across? The myth of bridges collapsing after certain prayers is not only about fear, it is about reverence for language itself. Words were seen as forces equal to stone, capable of shaping the world. And perhaps that is why these stories still hold power today. They remind us that no bridge is unshakable, no threshold eternal, and that sometimes, all it takes to bring down what seems indestructible is a voice lifted in prayer. What if the greatest secret hidden beneath the arches of bridges is not stone or steel, but sacrifice? In whispers passed down across centuries, tales speak of children offered to rivers and spirits, their lives exchanged for the strength of the bridge above them. These stories are not confined to one culture. They appear across continents, carrying the same terrible theme, that bridges demanded more than labor. They demanded blood. In Eastern Europe, folk legends describe masons burying infants alive in the foundations of bridges. The belief was that the soul of the child would hold the stones together, binding the structure with a life too young to resist. Mothers were said to be tricked, told their babies were to be blessed, only to hear cries vanish into mortar. The bridge stood strong, but beneath it echoed the silence of stolen lives. Similar accounts appear in Japan. Some bridges, villagers claimed, would not stop collapsing until a human sacrifice was buried beneath the central pillar. Children, seen as pure and untainted, were considered the strongest offerings. Their spirits would become guardians of the bridge, preventing floods or collapse. Families who resisted were cursed, their crops failing, their houses falling apart. The choice was never truly a choice. It was obedience or ruin. In Balkan folklore, one haunting tale tells of a mason who was commanded to place his own child into the wall of a bridge. He obeyed, sealing the small body inside. The bridge never fell again. Travelers crossing it whispered prayers for the unseen child, calling the structure both miracle and tomb. Even now, ruins of bridges in the region are said to carry an unnatural chill, as though the breath of that buried soul still lingers. The logic, twisted as it seems, carried its own dark consistency. Bridges were thresholds, fragile links between life and death, land and water. To hold such power, they needed a soul bound into them, a spirit too innocent to resist serving forever. Children became the chosen currency, their lives believed to anchor the fragile balance between nature's wrath and human ambition. Anthropologists sometimes suggest these stories were metaphors for the sacrifices of labor, families losing children to disease or accident during construction. But the repetition across cultures raises a heavier question. Were some of these more than stories? Archaeological digs near ancient bridges have uncovered tiny skeletons buried in foundation trenches. Whether ritual or coincidence, the discovery haunts the myths with grim weight. Even in Africa, oral traditions describe rivers demanding child offerings before bridges could stand. The belief was simple: water spirits hungered for innocence, and if denied, they would rise in floods and swallow the bridge whole. Communities obeyed, handing over their most precious lives for the promise of survival. For them, the bridge was not victory. It was a grave marker carved in stone. What makes these tales most horrifying is not only the act itself, but the silence afterward. Bridges stood proudly, admired as feats of human skill, while beneath them, children's souls were chained forever. Generations crossed those spans, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the price. The bridge became both marvel and mausoleum, a place where progress was written in cries no one dared to remember. So the question lingers. When we cross ancient bridges today, do we walk only on stone, or also on the restless spirits sealed beneath? If the legends are true, then every step we take is not over water, but over the unmarked graves of children traded for safety. And if so, whose strength really holds the bridge together, the mason's craft, or the soul that never had a chance to leave? What if beneath the arches of ancient bridges, where shadows linger and eyes rarely wander, strange symbols were carved, not decorative, not random, but deliberate markings left as messages for gods, spirits, or perhaps even the dead? Across continents, archaeologists and travelers have recorded carvings on the undersides of bridges. Spirals, runes, crosses, eyes, serpents, suns, moons. They were placed where few would see them, hidden beneath the flow of daily life. Who were they for, if not for us? The answer whispers that bridges were not built only for human passage. They were built as contracts with the unseen. In medieval Europe, masons often left secret signs beneath arches. These were not the proud insignias found on cathedrals, meant for recognition or artistry. They were etched in the dark, where water lapped at stone and where travelers would never notice. Circles within circles, labyrinths, arrows pointing downward, marks of containment, protection, or warding. Folklore suggests they were meant to confuse spirits that haunted the waters below. If a soul tried to rise, it would become trapped in the endless loops of carved symbols. In the Balkans, crosses were carved upside down beneath bridges. Villagers said it was to trap devils who prowled the rivers at night. A devil crossing upward would see the cross inverted and become ensnared, bound in the stone itself. Some claimed that these carvings glowed faintly at midnight, as though charged by the prayers of the builders. Even today, old bridges bear faint etchings like scratches, their meanings forgotten, but their presence undeniable. In Japan, under certain Shinto shrine bridges, carvings of foxes and dragons were hidden beneath. Foxes, trickster spirits, were believed to guard thresholds, while dragons commanded rivers and storms. These carvings were never visible from above. They were carved where only the river itself could see. To decorate the underside was to speak directly to the spirit of the water, acknowledging its power. Travelers who crossed never knew, but beneath their feet, an entire conversation between humans and spirits unfolded in silence. In South America, strange spirals and suns carved beneath Incan bridges have puzzled archaeologists. Some suggest they were calendars, tracking floods or celestial events, but local oral traditions insist they were soul markers, meant to guide spirits traveling under the river. When the dead crossed, their souls followed the carvings like maps, spiraling toward the afterlife. Thus, the underside of the bridge became more important than the surface. The living crossed above. The dead, guided by symbols, crossed below. China holds another layer of mystery. Taoist stonemasons often carved talismans beneath bridges, hidden charms in the form of celestial diagrams or thunder symbols. These were designed to channel energy, keeping bridges stable not only physically, but spiritually. The logic was simple. A bridge stood between forces, between yin and yang, between land and water. Symbols carved beneath acted like locks, holding harmony in place. Without them, the bridge would not merely collapse structurally, but cosmologically. In Norse lands, runes were sometimes found under stone spans. Archaeologists uncovered phrases invoking protection from frost giants, sea serpents, or the gods themselves. To carve such symbols where only water could wash them was to make an offering. Some inscriptions were even meant for the eyes of the dead, references to Hell's bridge in the underworld. The living never saw these runes. They were written for realms beyond sight. The psychology of hiding symbols is telling. Humans crave ritual, but they also crave secrecy. To inscribe signs beneath arches is to place faith where no human audience exists. It is a declaration to unseen forces. We know you are here. Bridges became contracts not only between people and places, but between worlds. The underside of an arch was not neglected space. It was a hidden altar. Modern discoveries confirm the persistence of these practices. Divers exploring sunken bridges in Eastern Europe reported carvings of eyes staring outward, worn smooth by centuries of water. Some eyes were arranged in rows, as though watching the depths eternally. In Central Asia, stone bridges revealed carved serpents winding along their undersides, invisible to anyone walking above. Scholars speculate these were meant to bind river spirits in the stone, serpents holding chaos in place. But legends go further. In Eastern Europe, there are stories of masons who carved names beneath arches. Not their own, but the names of villagers. To inscribe a name was to bind that person's spirit to the bridge, ensuring it would not collapse. Yet, if the bridge ever fell, those bound spirits were said to drown with it, dragged into the river. The practice was half blessing, half curse, a reminder that bridges carried not only travelers, but the weight of entire communities. In Africa, anthropologists found symbols resembling spirals and zigzags carved beneath colonial-era bridges, though local elders insisted the practice was far older. These patterns echoed traditional water charms, designed to appease river deities. The underside of the bridge, invisible to humans, was offered to the spirits below as their own canvas. The carvings were a gift, art made for the unseen. Travelers above never knew that they walked on top of sacred offerings. Some of the most disturbing finds come from the Middle East, where explorers discovered inverted inscriptions carved beneath Ottoman bridges. These words, when translated, read like bargains. "Take not the living, take only the stones." Such prayers carved upside down were thought to confuse malevolent forces, tricking them into taking the structure itself rather than the people. The bridge became a decoy, a sacrifice written in stone. In Mesoamerica, symbols under bridges sometimes formed entire narratives. Carvings of jaguars, serpents, and suns told stories of gods guiding souls across rivers of death. These were not decorative murals, but sacred scripts, visible only to water and shadow. To pass beneath the bridge as a spirit was to read the instructions left behind. The living may never have noticed, but the dead were literate in stone. What makes these symbols even more unsettling is their secrecy. They were placed where almost no one could see, yet masons still carved with precision. This means the carvings were never meant for human recognition. They were for gods, demons, ancestors, or the earth itself. To write beneath an arch was to converse with the invisible. Every step above echoed with meanings buried below. In China, some bridges were found with carved thunderbolts and suns beneath, marks associated with Taoist talismans. To scholars, these seemed like spells, channeling energy to hold the structure steady. But folk traditions whisper another possibility, that these symbols were warnings. A thunderbolt beneath an arch meant danger above, as if to say the bridge was temporary, unsafe, already claimed by forces of heaven. Perhaps the carvings were both, protective charms and ominous prophecies. In Norse sagas, there are fragments describing hidden runes beneath the crossings. These runes were often charms of binding, meant to lock away trolls or sea monsters said to lurk in rivers. To carve a rune beneath an arch was to imprison chaos beneath the feet of travelers. The bridge itself became both prison and guardian, every symbol another chain. The runes remained hidden, for secrecy gave them power. To reveal them would release what they bound. Modern researchers studying forgotten bridges often note feelings of unease when working beneath them. Divers and archaeologists alike report sensations of being watched, as though the carvings themselves were eyes. Some even describe dreams after fieldwork, dreams of rivers running backward, or of symbols glowing faintly underwater. Skeptics blame suggestion, but the repetition of these accounts across continents suggests something deeper. The carvings are not inert, they are still speaking, even if we have forgotten the language. The psychology of secrecy is central here. When humans hide meaning, it becomes charged. A carving beneath a bridge arch is not decoration. It is ritual. It transforms the structure into a double world, visible order above, hidden magic below. The symbols create balance, making the bridge safe for both living travelers and unseen forces. To ignore them is to see only half the truth. And perhaps that is the point. Bridges were never only for us. They were thresholds, stages upon which the living and dead, the seen and unseen, all crossed. The symbols carved beneath arches were the silent contracts of this crossing. They remain there still, waiting in shadow, unread but not forgotten. So the next time you pass across an old bridge, pause. Consider not what you see above, but what lies hidden below. Strange spirals, runes, eyes, names, marks carved for watchers beyond our sight. They may not be meant for you, but they hold you all the same. Perhaps that is why so many bridges feel uncanny, because beneath them lies a language not written for us, but written against us, or for those who will come after. A secret scripture in stone, hidden in shadow, still holding the arches in place. What if bridges, instead of demanding only coins or labor, demanded something darker? Tributes not to kings or rulers, but to demons. Folk tales across the world whisper of demon tolls, sinister payments required to cross certain spans. These tolls were not measured in silver, but in fear, blood, memory, or even human lives. To walk onto such bridges was to bargain with forces that waited in shadow, ancient collectors who claimed ownership not of the bridge itself, but of the right to pass. In Eastern Europe, peasants told stories of bridges that belonged to the devil. To cross them at night meant meeting a figure cloaked in shadow who demanded a toll. Sometimes the payment was a single coin tossed into the river, sometimes a drop of blood drawn with a knife, and sometimes, most terrible of all, the life of the youngest traveler in the group. The belief was so strong that families avoided crossing bridges after dusk, carrying the dead across only at dawn, so the demon would not appear. In Wales, legends of devil's bridges persist to this day. In these stories, the devil builds a bridge in exchange for the soul of the first who crosses. Cunning villagers often tricked him, sending a dog or goat first. But the tale carries a darker undertone, the idea that bridges themselves were bargains with darkness, structures born from deals humanity was never meant to strike. To walk across was to acknowledge that someone, somewhere, had already paid the toll. In Japan, yokai folklore tells of river demons who lurked beneath bridges. These creatures demanded offerings from travelers, rice balls, sake, or hair clippings thrown into the water. If the offerings were not made, the yokai would seize the traveler's shadow, leaving them weakened or cursed. The toll was invisible, but devastating. Shadows, after all, were thought to be pieces of the soul. To lose it was to cross safely in body, but forever diminished in spirit. Among Slavic traditions, the chert or demon of the river demanded tolls and whispers. Travelers claimed they heard voices under arches at midnight, asking for something personal. Rings, teeth, even whispered confessions. To ignore the demand was to risk being pulled into the water, never seen again. In this way, the toll became not only physical, but psychological, forcing travelers to give away pieces of themselves they could never reclaim. In South America, myths tell of bridges where demons demanded tolls of memory. Elders spoke of travelers who crossed safely, but afterward forgot their own names or families. The price of passage was amnesia, a toll that erased identity. Villagers avoided such bridges, walking miles around rather than risk losing who they were. Yet, the bridges stood strong, as if fueled by the lives they drained. The Middle East offers stories of jinn who claimed ownership of ancient stone bridges. These beings demanded not gold, but prayers spoken in their name. To cross without uttering the prayer was to invite disaster. Storms, floods, or collapses said to be the jinn's punishment. Over time, travelers developed elaborate rituals before crossing. Bowing, whispering words, tossing stones into rivers. The toll was not money, but submission, a recognition of power beyond human authority. In Norse sagas, the idea of tolls was connected to Hell's Bridge in the underworld. Spirits had to pay with memories or words of honor before passing. When real bridges were built, echoes of this myth bled into folklore. Villagers feared trolls beneath bridges, demanding tolls from travelers. These were not playful figures of children's tales, but terrifying beings who could tear men apart. Payment was safety, but refusal was annihilation. The toll was a contract enforced by terror. The psychology of these tales reveals a deep human anxiety. The fear that nothing is free. To cross a bridge, a threshold, a liminal space, was to court danger. The demon toll was a narrative that embodied this fear, making travelers conscious of the risk. To pay meant survival. To refuse meant disappearance. Bridges became not only architectural feats, but moral and spiritual tests, demanding tribute from every soul who dared their spans. Archaeological hints suggest the myths were more than stories. In some regions, coins and bones have been found buried at bridge entrances, offerings left not for human toll collectors, but for unseen ones. Inscriptions near ruined bridges refer to guardians and keepers of passage, language more spiritual than practical. These findings suggest that ancient builders and travelers alike treated bridges as places of negotiation with the other world. But the stories grow darker still. In some Balkan folk tales, the demon toll was not collected every time, but only once every year. On a certain night, often the solstice, the demon would emerge and claim the first traveler who dared to cross. Families marked those nights with fear, refusing to approach the river. Yet there were always the desperate or the unlucky, the one who vanished, becoming the toll that renewed the bargain for another year. The bridge stood strong, but it stood on sacrifice. In African traditions, river spirits known as Mami Wata were said to collect tolls at bridges. They demanded beauty, combs, jewelry, or even strands of hair. Some stories say they demanded the most beautiful girl in the village each generation, taken beneath the water in exchange for the bridge's survival. The toll was both material and human, weaving vanity, fear, and worship into a single chilling ritual. In Central Asia, travelers told of whispering bridges, where disembodied voices demanded secrets before allowing passage. To confess a sin aloud was to pay the toll. To refuse was to risk being dragged into the river. Such stories turned bridges into confessional chambers, places where truth itself became currency. Those who survived the crossing carried the relief of confession, but also the terror of knowing they had been heard by something other than human ears. The Americas hold echoes of the same. Among the Maya, bridges were thought to connect not only villages, but worlds. Folktales claimed demons beneath demanded offerings of blood. A traveler would prick their finger and let drops fall into the river as they crossed. Without the toll, the demon might claim the traveler's whole body. These rituals blurred into larger practices of sacrifice, binding blood to stone, crossing to survival. In medieval Europe, the tolls sometimes became perverse games. Travelers said demons asked riddles, and if the answer was wrong, the bridge collapsed, or the traveler was dragged into the water. Payment was not only coin or blood, but intellect. Folklore made the crossing into a contest, the demon both toll keeper and judge. This motif survives in fairy tales, where trolls demand riddles or tricks, but beneath the whimsy lies the memory of terror. The persistence of these tales across cultures points to something universal. Bridges were terrifying places, spanning voids where accidents and deaths were common. Demons and spirits became the faces of those dangers, and tolls became the language of control. By imagining payments, people explained the randomness of survival. If a neighbor vanished on a bridge, it was not senseless. It was because they failed to pay. The toll myth gave tragedy meaning. In the Middle East, Islamic folklore sometimes speaks of bridges in terms of divine tolls. The Sirat bridge in the afterlife, thinner than a hair, allows only the righteous to cross. Though not demonic, it reflects the same fear. Crossing is never guaranteed, and what you carry, your deeds, your faith, is the toll. The earthly stories of demon tolls mirror this spiritual belief. Every crossing, earthly or cosmic, has a price. Archaeologists studying European bridge ruins found caches of coins, some deliberately scratched or pierced. These were not coins for human collectors, but ritual deposits, tolls prepaid to unseen guardians. Sometimes, bones of animals were discovered alongside, as though entire crossings were rehearsed in sacrifice before the bridge opened. The offerings suggest communities believed firmly in paying unseen tolls, binding myth into practice. And what of modern echoes? Even now, people throw coins into fountains and rivers beneath bridges, a ritual act rarely questioned. Locks on bridges, offerings of flowers, whispered vows, all are tolls of a softer kind. They echo the ancient bargain, substituting romance for terror, but the instinct remains. You must give something when you cross. The most haunting element of the demon toll stories is their subtle implication. The demon does not take what you choose. It takes what you fear to lose most. For one traveler, it might be a coin. For another, a child. For another, a secret or memory. The toll adapts, reflecting the vulnerability of the soul that dares the crossing. And so, The tales endure because they capture a universal truth. Every threshold tests us differently. So the next time you cross a bridge, pause. Listen to the echo of your footsteps. Remember that for centuries, people believed that shadows waited beneath, collecting tolls too terrible to name. And ask yourself, if the demons still waited there, what would it take from you? What would your toll be, whispered into the stone, claimed by the unseen as the price of safe passage? What if the reason so many old bridges lead directly to cemeteries is not coincidence, but design? Across cultures, pathways to the land of the dead were often marked by a bridge. These bridges did not simply connect one village to another. They connected the living to the departed, the known to the unknown. To step upon them was to move closer not only to graves, but to mysteries of afterlife itself. In medieval Europe, records show that cemeteries were often deliberately placed across rivers or streams, with bridges leading the way. The geography was more than practical. It was symbolic. Rivers represented boundaries, the line between life and death, and the bridge was the crossing point. To bury the dead beyond the water was to say, they have crossed over. The living walked the same bridge, but to them it was ritual reminder of what awaited. In Japan, many ancient cemeteries are approached by bridges. Shinto and Buddhist beliefs both regard bridges as liminal spaces, gateways where the sacred and profane meet. To cross a bridge toward graves was to cleanse oneself, to symbolically step out of the living world and into communion with spirits. Some bridges were painted red, the color of protection, so that the souls of the dead could not follow the living back across. Among the Norse, the mythic Gjallarbrú, the bridge over the river Gjall, guarded the entrance to hell, the realm of the dead. When archaeologists find Scandinavian cemeteries near rivers crossed by bridges, folklore illuminates the logic. Burial grounds were framed as otherworldly realms, reachable only by crossing a threshold. Real bridges mirrored mythical ones, reminding mourners that their dead had gone where they too would one day follow. In South America, the Inca built rope bridges leading to sacred burial cliffs. To cross such a span was to risk one's life physically, just as death itself was a risk. The bridge's fragility emphasized the precariousness of existence, while its destination, burial grounds suspended high above, linked the soul to the sky. The living crossed to honor the dead, enacting in miniature the cosmic crossing believed to await all souls. Even in the Middle East, traditions place cemeteries across rivers. Islam speaks of the Sirat Bridge, thinner than a hair, which all souls must cross after death to reach paradise. Earthly bridges near burial sites echoed this divine crossing. They were not just roads, but rehearsals of the afterlife. Walking toward a graveyard meant practicing the final crossing every human must one day make. In Eastern Europe, bridges were built deliberately before graveyards, and rituals surrounded them. Pallbearers paused midway, whispering prayers, asking permission for the dead to pass. Villagers believed that without such rituals, the spirit might refuse to stay in the cemetery, returning across the bridge to haunt the living. Thus, the bridge became both passage and barrier, the last door to close behind the soul. The psychology is clear. Bridges near cemeteries dramatize the truth of mortality. They embody the separation between worlds, the inevitability of the crossing we cannot avoid. To build cemeteries beyond water is to remind every mourner, you too will cross. The bridge becomes an unavoidable sermon in stone and wood, silent but relentless. But folklore offers even deeper layers. In Romanian traditions, bridges near cemeteries were thought to be guarded by spirits themselves. Travelers at night reported hearing footsteps on the planks, though no one was visible. Some claimed these were the souls of the recently dead, pacing at the threshold, deciding whether to cross fully into the land of the departed. The bridge was not passive, it was alive, a stage upon which souls hesitated between two realms. In Greek villages, old stone bridges often lead directly to burial grounds, echoing the myth of Charon, the ferryman who rowed souls across the river Styx. Instead of boats, villagers imagined bridges as Charon's stone replacements, fixed crossings that allowed mourners to walk the symbolic journey themselves. Coins placed on graves, meant for Charon, were also sometimes tossed into waters beneath cemetery bridges, doubling the gesture. The bridge itself became Charon's toll gate. India provides similar echoes. Hindu cremation grounds are often placed across rivers, with bridges leading the way. The river is sacred, a purifier, and the bridge a threshold. Crossing toward the dead was not only practical but spiritual. Families symbolically accompanied the soul across the waters. Rituals performed midway, such as scattering flowers or rice into the current, were offerings to Yama, the god of death, acknowledging his authority over the crossing. In Celtic folklore, bridges near graveyards were thought to confuse wandering spirits. The belief was that ghosts traveled in straight lines. By placing a river and bridge before the cemetery, spirits would be trapped, circling endlessly at the threshold, unable to return to the village. Symbols carved under arches reinforced the trap. Thus, cemeteries across bridges were not only destinations for the dead, but prisons for restless souls. Archaeologists in Scandinavia uncovered burial mounds aligned with bridge approaches, suggesting funerals were choreographed journeys. The mourners processed across the bridge, carried the body to the mound, and returned lighter, as though leaving a burden behind. The bridge was a filter, one way for the dead, another for the living. Its stones absorbed grief, leaving the survivors able to walk back cleansed. South American myths enrich this picture. Among the Mapuche of Chile, rivers were believed to be barriers to the land of souls. The bridge was a gift, but it was also dangerous. Elders told of demons who lurked beneath, waiting for the unworthy dead. To cross safely, prayers were whispered on the bridge itself, bargaining for mercy. Cemeteries beyond rivers were thus double symbolic, a place of rest, but also a place of judgment. China, too, embeds this symbolism in ritual. During the Ghost Festival, temporary bridges are built across streams, leading to ancestral shrines and graves. Paper lanterns float on the water, guiding spirits along invisible paths. The act is both remembrance and rehearsal. Families walk across the bridges as if accompanying the dead, affirming that the link between living and departed still exists. Permanent bridges near cemeteries amplify this idea, standing as constant conduits between realms. What unites these traditions is a profound recognition. Death is a crossing. Whether by boat, by ford, or by bridge, the dead must be carried beyond a boundary. To place cemeteries across rivers is to embody this belief in landscape itself. The mourner becomes participant, retracing the soul's steps. The bridge ensures that every funeral is a ritual, every burial a crossing enacted twice, once for the dead, once for the living who walk behind. There is also the question of why so many ghost stories linger at these cemetery bridges. Travelers claim to see figures waiting at the far side, only to vanish when approached. Others hear weeping beneath the arches, as though the bridge itself carries the voices of mourners long gone. In some tales, phantom processions cross at midnight, pale figures carrying coffins, silent and endless, reenacting funerals that once passed. The bridge becomes a stage where grief is never finished, looping forever between. In folklore, such visions are warnings. To see a funeral on a bridge is to know another death approaches in the village. The bridge becomes not only a path to cemeteries, but a prophet. Its stones predict, its shadows whisper what is to come. These stories kept villagers cautious, respectful, and fearful. The bridge was not a neutral thing. It was an oracle, a place where the boundary thinned enough for the future to seep through. Anthropologists studying these practices argue that bridges to cemeteries also helped communities process fear. By embodying death in geography, people externalized what they could not otherwise face. The river became death itself, the bridge the journey, the cemetery the destination. To walk this path was to narrate grief in space, making the abstract real. Even today, mourners feel a strange shift of silence when they step onto such bridges, as though time itself pauses until they step off on the other side. The unsettling truth is that bridges to cemeteries are not only architecture, they are sermons carved in stone, preaching silently to every footstep. This is the path all must walk. We do not need priests to remind us. The geography itself does. To enter a cemetery by bridge is to look ahead at one's own fate, to feel the inevitability beneath the feet. Every mourner, knowingly or not, performs their own rehearsal of the final journey. Perhaps this is why so many cemeteries remain strangely peaceful despite their grim purpose. The bridges that lead to them absorb fear, transform it, and return it as acceptance. They remind us that crossing is not only loss, but continuity. the dead cross, and so shall we. The bridge stands as witness, patient and eternal, between the breath of life and the silence that follows. So when you next see a cemetery beyond a river, with a bridge leading to it, remember this. You are looking at one of humanity's oldest truths carved into the earth. The truth that we walk a path every soul has walked before. The truth that bridges do not only connect towns, they connect worlds. And perhaps, if you pause on such a bridge long enough, you might hear footsteps beside you, not of the living, but of those who already crossed, reminding you that someday you will follow. What if travel itself, especially across bridges, was never truly about reaching another destination, but about enacting ritual passage? What if every journey outward was secretly a rehearsal of the final journey inward, the one all must eventually take toward death? Ancient traditions suggest that bridges and travel were often framed not as practical tools, but as ceremonies, disguised as daily life. Each crossing was a rite, every step a symbolic passage from one state of being to another. In many cultures, the act of travel was inseparable from ritual. Among the Greeks, every departure began with libations to Hermes, the guide of travelers, but also of souls. To step onto a bridge was to invoke him twice, first as patron of journeys, then as psychopomp of the dead. Travel and death blurred. To walk a bridge was to enact the same motion your soul would one day make, guided by Hermes across the ultimate threshold. In Japan, the Shinto view of bridges as hashi, liminal spaces, meant that every crossing was a miniature purification. Before setting out on a journey, travelers often paused at shrine bridges, washing their hands in water, bowing, stepping carefully across. These gestures were not about reaching new lands, but about aligning the self with the unseen. Travel became ritual, the road secondary to the passage itself. The Norse saw something similar. Their myths described Bifrost, the rainbow bridge between worlds, which gods and souls alike crossed. Real travel, then, echoed this cosmic template. To leave one's village and cross a wooden span over a river was to mimic the great crossing between realms. Perhaps that is why sagas describe travelers praying at bridges before venturing further. Each journey outward was framed as brush with the eternal. In India, pilgrimage routes were thick with symbolism. The Ganges and Yamuna rivers, crossed by bridges or boats, were not obstacles, but sacred thresholds. To travel was to engage in ritual passage, each step dissolving part of the ego, preparing the traveler for the ultimate letting go. Even mundane trips carried this echo, for every traveler knew the myth. One day the soul must cross the Vaitarani river of the dead. Every crossing in life rehearsed the crossing in death. This view reframes the very concept of roads and bridges. Perhaps they were never only about trade, politics, or conquest. Perhaps they were built to disguise ritual, to make sacred passage seem ordinary. Communities could perform ceremonies daily by traveling, paying tolls, and crossing thresholds. The road became altar, the bridge liturgy, the traveler priest, and sacrifice in one. The psychology is profound. Humans fear death, yet we walk daily across thresholds that symbolize it. By cloaking ritual as travel, cultures allowed people to confront mortality indirectly. Each crossing was both practical and spiritual, binding survival to symbolism. Travel was not only necessity, but therapy, training souls for the journey no one escapes. Evidence supports this. Archaeologists find shrines at bridge entrances worldwide. Small altars, coins, bones, offerings. Why would these exist if travel were purely practical? They reveal that every departure was ritualized. The traveler enacted ceremonies as naturally as breathing, perhaps never naming them as such. Travel was excuse. Ritual was the true purpose. Even language hints at this truth. In Latin, the word pontifex means bridge builder, but also refers to priests. To build a bridge was to perform sacred work. To cross one was to participate in liturgy. Similarly, in many tongues, words for road or way overlap with terms for life path or fate. Travel was never neutral. It was sacred metaphor embodied in dust and stone. Imagine this: a villager leaving home for trade. He crosses a small bridge, tosses a coin into the stream below, whispers a prayer. To him, it seems habit, superstition. But in truth, he has enacted ritual passage, symbolically dying and being reborn with every journey. He returns home not just with goods, but renewed, transformed by reenacting the eternal crossing. The market was excuse. The ritual was the true journey. Modern echoes remain. Tourists throw coins from bridges, commuters touch charms before leaving, pilots speak prayers before flights. We call them traditions, habits, or superstitions. But beneath them lies the same ancient instinct, that travel is ritual disguised as necessity. The car, the train, the plane, they are modern bridges. Every trip is still a rehearsal of the final passage. But let us dive deeper. Consider the Roman roads stretching across empires. Historians admire them as feats of engineering, arteries of conquest and trade. Yet, at nearly every major junction stood shrines, altars to Mercury, to local spirits, to ancestors. Travelers poured wine, left coins, whispered prayers before proceeding. These were not trivial acts. They were rituals of passage woven into the daily fabric of movement. Roads disguised as sacred scripts, bridges disguised as temples. The empire itself moved as one enormous ritual machine. Medieval Europe continued this fusion. Pilgrims to Santiago or Canterbury crossed countless bridges marked with crosses or chapels. Each crossing demanded pause, prayer, reflection. The journey was never just about reaching a holy site. It was the holy site, stretched across miles. Every bridge became a miniature church, every step a prayer, every inn a ritual station. Travel was a moving liturgy, performed unconsciously by the masses. Among Native American traditions, travel often mirrored spiritual passage. Some tribes described rivers as thresholds between worlds, with crossings requiring song or offering. Journeys to hunt or trade became layered with ritual acts, sprinkling tobacco, singing to water spirits, painting faces. These actions disguised ritual as travel, ensuring every outward journey doubled as communion with the unseen. Africa's traditions echo the same. Among the Yoruba, roads and crossroads were sacred to Eshu, the trickster and messenger between gods and humans. To begin a journey without acknowledging him was folly. Travelers made small offerings at crossings: shells, food, palm wine. To outsiders, it looked like custom. In truth, it was ritual passage enacted daily, binding every journey to cosmic balance. Even the architecture of bridges suggests ritual intent. Many ancient spans were elaborately decorated beneath, where only spirits or water could see. Why carve symbols in places invisible to travelers, unless the bridge was meant for more than human eyes? These designs were not for utility, but for rite, signaling that every crossing was witnessed, recorded in the hidden ledgers of gods and dead. The anthropology of ritual teaches that societies disguise sacred acts within ordinary life to ensure participation. Travel offered the perfect disguise. No one could avoid it, so no one could avoid ritual. The peasant, the merchant, the warrior, all enacted ceremonies as they crossed bridges and roads. The surface act was commerce or conquest. The hidden act was rehearsal for death. Psychologically, this made sense. By performing rituals unconsciously during travel, people confronted mortality without paralysis. The repetition eased fear, embedding comfort in routine. Each trip reinforced the lesson. You will cross, you will return, until one day you cross and do not. Travel was a slow schooling in the inevitability of death, a sacred pedagogy disguised as movement. Even myths hint at this. The Odyssey, often read as adventure, is saturated with funerary echoes, crossings of seas, descents into underworlds, returns from symbolic death. Odysseus's travels are not merely geographical. They are ritual rehearsals for the soul's passage. Likewise, Dante's Divine Comedy frames travel itself as pilgrimage through death, every step a metaphor. Literature mirrors ritual truth. Travel is passage masked as narrative. Modernity has not erased this instinct. Airports, with their checkpoints, rituals of boarding, and symbolic transitions from land to sky, mirror ancient rites. The airplane itself is a bridge across void. Passengers submit passports, prayers, seatbelt chants, meals timed like liturgies. They emerge transformed, reborn in another land. What seems mundane is ritual disguised in steel and schedule. Even digital travel echoes this truth. Online journeys are framed as crossing platforms, navigating links. Our metaphors remain spatial, threshold-based, ritualistic. We do not escape the instinct. Every transition becomes passage, every passage ritual. The disguise grows thinner the more closely we look. Picture a funeral procession in medieval times. The mourners cross a bridge on their way to the graveyard. They pause, lower the coffin, whisper prayers. On the surface, it is tradition. Beneath, it is ritual passage enacted consciously, a miniature version of the final crossing. Now, picture a merchant crossing the same bridge days later, tossing a coin into the river. He does not think of death, only of luck. Yet, his gesture echoes the same rite. Death's rehearsal is hidden in every crossing, disguised as custom. This double meaning explains why so many travelers across history felt unease at thresholds. They sensed instinctively that they were not merely moving, they were enacting something larger. Ritual cloaked as routine, passage cloaked as purpose. Bridges were not built only for roads, but for souls. Roads were not laid only for markets, but for myths. Perhaps this is why travel has always been transformative, even today. A simple trip leaves us altered. We return home different, carrying more than goods, carrying echoes of the ritual enacted in our passage. The disguise persists, but the truth leaks through. Travel is ritual, and ritual is travel. So, when you next cross a bridge or set out on a road, ask yourself, what are you truly doing? Are you going somewhere new, or are you rehearsing once more the passage all must one day take? Travel may always have been the mask we wear to practice death, the ordinary costume draped over the most sacred ritual of all, character count, approximately 11,360. What if bridges were never truly built for the living? What if every arch of stone and timber we see as a path for feet and hooves was in fact a shrine, a ritual instrument, or a passage meant more for souls than for people? To ask this question is to overturn everything we assume about ancient engineering. Perhaps bridges were not utilitarian at all, but sacred, structures masquerading as roads while secretly serving the dead. Archaeology already hints at this unsettling truth. Many of the oldest bridges lead not to markets or cities, but to cemeteries, temples, or desolate places. Some span rivers where no trade routes existed. Others connect isolated hills or fields that held no economic value. To the living, they seem useless. To the dead, they were essential. They were not shortcuts for merchants, but thresholds for spirits, guiding them between worlds. Folklore reinforces this suspicion. Legends from Greece to India insist that souls must cross bridges after death, the Gyala Bru of Norse myth, the Chinvat Bridge of Zoroastrian belief, the Sirat of Islamic tradition, the Vaitarani of Hindu lore. When real bridges mirrored these myths, were they built for wagons, or were they modeled as earthly replicas of cosmic crossings? Perhaps the living merely borrowed what was meant for the dead. Consider how many bridges bear carvings, symbols, or offerings buried in their foundations. These are not hallmarks of utility, but of ritual. Why carve runes beneath an arch if not to speak to unseen forces? Why bury bones, coins, or even children in the mortar unless the bridge was an altar? The evidence suggests that bridges were less about moving goods than about binding contracts with gods, spirits, and the river itself. The question grows sharper when we see how often bridges were feared. Communities whispered of demons lurking beneath, of tolls demanded in blood, of spirits that haunted arches. If bridges truly served the living, why would they be shunned at night, avoided during certain rituals, or believed to collapse at prayers? These are not the marks of roads, but of shrines, places the living approached with caution because they knew they were not the intended audience. Even linguistics betrays the truth. The word pontifex, meaning bridge builder, became the title of Roman high priests. To build a bridge was sacred labor, not civic. The priest was literally the maker of thresholds, keeper of passage between gods and mortals. If bridges were for wagons, why entrust them to priests? Why imbue them with titles of cosmic weight? The language reveals what time has hidden. Bridges were spiritual tools, later repurposed for traffic. Psychologically, it makes sense. To humans, rivers were terrifying, barriers that swallowed lives. To tame them with bridges was to defy nature. But perhaps people did not believe they tamed rivers for themselves. Perhaps they believed they built offerings, sacrifices of stone to appease the water so the souls of their dead could cross in peace. The living walked afterward, not because the bridge was made for them, but because they imitated the dead's passage, rehearsing their own eventual crossing. Look at placement. Why do so many bridges lead to nowhere, ending abruptly in fields or spanning rivers that vanish? Archaeologists call them mistakes, relics of lost routes. But what if they were deliberate? Bridges built where no road was needed, serving ceremonies we cannot reconstruct. People gathered, crossed, prayed, returned. The bridge was not transport. It was theater, ritual space, a stage for death's rehearsal. Think of the rituals tied to bridges across time. In Eastern Europe, pallbearers paused at bridges with coffins, lowering them slightly before proceeding. The bridge was the soul's checkpoint, not the family's shortcut. In Japan, red bridges leading to shrines were painted not for commerce, but for spirits, marking thresholds only the sacred should cross. In South America, bridges to burial cliffs were fragile, woven rope demanding faith as much as strength. None of these practices suggest convenience for the living. In Africa, river crossings were often treated as sacred trials. Bridges, when they existed, were accompanied by offerings, libations poured to water spirits. Some traditions even forbade casual use. To cross was to perform ritual, even if one was merely traveling to the next village. The bridge served the spirits who owned the water, not the people who borrowed its span. The pattern repeats worldwide. If bridges were for the living, why were they so often wrapped in fear, legend, and taboo? If they were for traffic, why burden them with sacrifices, symbols, and myths of collapse? The answer is stark. Because they were never truly ours. They were gates disguised as roads, tools for unseen travelers cloaked in stone and wood. Archaeological puzzles deepen this suspicion. Excavations reveal coins, bones, and figurines buried not at bridge entrances but in their cores, places no human would access again. These offerings were for eternity, not toll collectors. They suggest the builders were feeding the bridge itself, or the spirits it served. In some sites, skeletons of animals, even humans, appear sealed in foundations. These are not the acts of engineers. They are the acts of priests. And what of the countless stories where bridges collapse, not from decay, but from ritual? Tales of whispered prayers bringing arches down, of demons demanding tolls, of spirits haunting foundations. A road does not behave this way. A shrine does. Bridges behave like sacred objects, fragile under desecration, powerful under reverence. Their lives are tied not only to stone, but to ritual observance. Even etymology confirms the suspicion. In many languages, way, path, or bridge carries double meaning, literal route, spiritual journey. In Sanskrit, tirtha means both crossing place and sacred ford. Pilgrims traveled to tirthas not for efficiency, but for salvation. The crossing was the point. The road was the ritual. To confuse this with commerce is to forget the weight of words. Imagine walking across an ancient bridge at dusk. The stones beneath your feet are not neutral. They are consecrated. Beneath them lie offerings you will never see, symbols carved for eyes not yours. You cross quickly, thinking only of arrival, but unseen presences watch, measuring your passage, deciding whether you are allowed to reach the far bank. Did the builders intend this? Or did they intend you to realize that your journey is not yours at all, but theirs? Consider also the enduring folklore of bridges as haunted places. Ghost lights flickering along spans, phantom processions seen at midnight, sounds of footsteps when no one is there. These stories are not about traffic. They are about ownership. The dead reclaim what was always theirs, walking bridges not as intruders, but as rightful users. If bridges served us, why would our stories so consistently place others, ghosts, demons, gods, as their primary inhabitants? In medieval Europe, devil's bridges are found everywhere, stone arches said to be built by Satan himself, usually in exchange for the soul of the first to cross. Villagers tricked him with dogs or goats, but the underlying belief remained. Bridges were born from bargains with the otherworldly. What kind of road begins in hell? Not one meant for markets, but one designed as ritual theater. Even in modern cities, remnants of this sacred view survive. Locks on Paris bridges, coins tossed into Venetian canals, offerings left on Japanese spans. Why do travelers instinctively turn bridges into places of vows and gifts? We do not do this on highways. We do it only on bridges because unconsciously we still sense what they are, sacred thresholds masquerading as infrastructure. The question grows even stranger when we think of the afterlife. Nearly every major religion describes a crossing over water, over fire, across a narrow span, where souls are judged. The Chinvat Bridge in Zoroastrianism widens for the righteous, narrows for the wicked. The Sirat in Islam is thinner than a hair, sharper than a sword. Christianity speaks of Christ as the bridge to salvation. These are not metaphors invented later. They are echoes of something older, something built in stone before Scripture. Archaeologists puzzled over Roman bridges whose alignments made little sense. Some spanned trickling streams, barely needing a plank. Others led to marshes rather than roads. Why build monumental arches for such trivial crossings? Unless the purpose was not movement, but meaning. The bridge itself was the event, the ritual act. To cross it was to participate in mystery. The destination did not matter. Think also of how bridges feature in folk tales as tests. Trolls demanding tolls, demons asking riddles, guardians insisting on sacrifices. These stories are echoes of an ancient recognition. Bridges are challenges, not conveniences. They are places where you prove yourself worthy of passage, where survival is not assumed, but earned. That is not the language of civil engineering. That is the language of ritual. Psychologically, this explains why people still hesitate at old spans. The shiver in the spine, the pause before stepping onto narrow arches, the silence people keep as they walk. We call it superstition, but it may be instinct. Some part of us knows the truth. This place is not ours. We borrow it, cross quickly, whisper thanks, and leave. The bridge serves others. We are guests. So, did bridges serve the living at all? Perhaps only by accident. Perhaps they were always for gods and ghosts, and we have spent millennia pretending otherwise. Every arch is a mask. Every crossing a ritual, every span an altar paved with stone. We stride across, thinking we are masters of the bridge. But the truth lingers in myths, rituals, and unease. We were never the intended travelers. We only walk where the dead already passed. What if the bridges we fear, the ones sealed by collapse, ruin, or deliberate destruction, were never meant to be reopened? What if those ancient arches were locked not by time, but by intention? And if someday they were restored, rebuilt, or rediscovered, what exactly would we find waiting on the other side? Across cultures, bridges are not simply architecture, they are thresholds. And thresholds are dangerous. They separate realms that should not mingle. When a bridge is closed, when its stones fall or its ropes rot, it is easy to think the closure is accident. But myths whisper another reason. Bridges fall to protect the living from what lies beyond. Reopening them risks disturbing balances older than civilization itself. Consider the stories of Devil's Bridges in Europe. Many of them stand abandoned, cut off from modern roads. Villagers claim the bridges could not be destroyed by human hands, only weakened by time, because their true strength was bound to bargains. To rebuild them fully would be to renew the bargain, to invite the demon back. What waits on the far side is not a meadow or a market, but the presence that demanded souls as tolls centuries ago. In Japanese folklore, bridges closed by storms were said to lead directly into the realm of the yokai. Reopening such a span meant reawakening dormant spirits. To cross again was to invite their return. Villagers often left such bridges half-broken, crossing streams by ford instead, because they believed the damage was divine will. Rebuilding was not repair, it was defiance, and defiance meant the other side would no longer remain quiet. The Norse spoke of Bifrost, the rainbow bridge, which one day would collapse in fire at Ragnarok. It was never meant to be rebuilt. Its destruction was fate's way of severing realms once and for all. But imagine if mortals tried to restore it. What would wait on the far side? Not gods in their golden halls, but a battlefield of the end times, a realm whose gates should never be pried open prematurely. Archaeology hints that this belief was not metaphor. Some ruined bridges discovered in Europe showed deliberate dismantling, stones removed, arches collapsed carefully rather than by accident. Why destroy a functioning bridge? Perhaps because people feared what was crossing it. To reopen such a bridge today, to reconstruct it with modern pride, would be to invite back the powers the ancients tried to seal away. In South America, Inca rope bridges were sometimes ritually cut and left unrepaired. To renew them meant repeating ceremonies, offerings, even sacrifices. Without them, the bridge was thought unsafe, not structurally, but spiritually. A rebuilt bridge without proper rites was considered a doorway thrown open without a lock, and whatever waited on the far side could step through unchallenged. The psychology is chilling. Closed bridges are wounds that were never stitched, left open to remind us of what cannot heal safely. To reopen them is to probe old scars, to call back spirits long banished. And myths agree, what returns is never benign. It is hungry, forgotten, patient. It waits not for our arrival, but for its chance to cross back into our world. So what does wait? Ghosts, say the Europeans. Yokai, say the Japanese. Hungry demons, say the Africans. Ancestors demanding recognition, say the Native Americans. Every culture fills the silence differently, but all agree the other side is occupied. The emptiness we imagine is illusion. To reopen is not to reclaim land. It is to unlock a door that was shut for a reason. Picture a ruined stone bridge in a forgotten forest, its arch broken, its far side swallowed by vines. For centuries, no one has crossed. But one day, modern hands restore it. The last stone slides into place, the arch complete again. And as the first traveler steps across, something else steps toward them, from a place that was not supposed to touch ours. That is the fear hidden in the question. If we reopen, do we truly cross to the other side, or does the other side finally cross to us? The ancient world is filled with warnings. Folklore rarely speaks of bridges reopening without consequence. In Romania, abandoned spans were called sleeping bridges. People believed that if they were disturbed, the spirits resting beneath would awaken in fury. These were not just ghosts of the dead, but guardians, bound by collapse to remain quiet. To mend the bridge was to break their chains, and once free, they would not be bound again. In Celtic lands, certain bridges were said to close because the gods had withdrawn their blessing. When floods or fires destroyed them, locals took it as a sign. The other side was no longer meant to be reached. Stories told of foolish kings who rebuilt such bridges anyway, only to find their armies vanish on the far bank, swallowed into mist, never returning. What waits on the other side? Perhaps not monsters, but absence itself, the void that swallows those who ignore divine warnings. The Middle East offers another angle. In Islamic eschatology, the Sirat bridge cannot be crossed until Judgment Day. To reopen a worldly bridge once destroyed was sometimes framed as hubris, an attempt to control a cosmic schedule. The idea was that such a span would lead not to the expected land, but directly into fire, because the appointed time was not yet. A reopened bridge was not a path. It was a premature descent into punishment. Even in China, feng shui masters cautioned against restoring broken bridges. The flow of qi, the life force of landscapes, had shifted. To reopen was to force energy backward, inviting imbalance. Spirits displaced by rivers and winds would not tolerate such interference. What waits on the other side is not a destination, but chaos, an eruption of forces thrown out of balance by human arrogance. Anthropologists point to a strange consistency. Cultures that viewed bridges as sacred thresholds all carried stories of their destruction as divine necessity. The bridge falls not because it is weak, but because it has served its purpose. To rebuild without permission is to trespass against forces larger than ourselves. What waits is punishment, not random, but deliberate, like a toll we refuse to acknowledge. Modern parallels make the question even more haunting. Consider the fascination with abandoned structures. Bridges overgrown in forests, railway spans rusting in silence. When explorers step onto them, they often report unease, sounds of footsteps behind them, sudden winds, feelings of being watched. We dismiss these as nerves, but they align eerily with folklore. The bridge is closed for a reason. The moment we walk upon it, we repeat the forbidden act of reopening. Perhaps the dread we feel is not our imag. Psychologically, we dread what we cannot see. A ruined bridge is a doorway blocked, a path interrupted. The human mind aches to complete it, to imagine what lies beyond. But in myth, the answer is always the same: danger, judgment, return of the forgotten. To reopen is to refuse the wisdom of closure, and closure in these stories is never arbitrary. It is protective. Picture again the ruined span, its stones half submerged. Imagine a ritual team rebuilding it, priests in robes, engineers in helmets, side by side. As they place the keystone, the air shifts. The river below grows still. The silence deepens. The first crossing is not triumph, but dread. Every culture says the same. The first to cross will not return. That traveler is toll, sacrifice, the price demanded by what waits. Folklore even dares to describe the moment of reopening. In Balkan tales, when an old bridge is restored, the first stone set in place bleeds, not metaphorically, but literally. Red liquid seeping through cracks, as if the bridge itself is alive and resents its resurrection. Builders are warned not to continue, but those who do finish the work find the bridge cursed. Travelers vanish. Livestock refuse to cross. Rivers swell unnaturally beneath. The message is clear. Some bridges are meant to stay dead. In West Africa, oral histories speak of sacred bridges that collapsed after great wars. Elders said these bridges fell because too many spirits of the slain tried to cross at once, breaking the balance. To rebuild them without appeasing those spirits was to invite them back, not as ancestors, but as restless armies. The other side of such bridges was described not as land, but as a battlefield frozen in spirit, waiting to spill back into the living world. Celtic myths go further. They say that when broken bridges are repaired, they no longer lead where they once did. Instead, the other side becomes enchanted. Distances fold, time bends, and travelers emerge in places they do not recognize, sometimes centuries later. Reopening is not restoration, but transformation, a bending of the world's fabric. What waits is not the familiar, but the uncanny, an altered reflection of what once was. Even modern legends reflect this unease. In rural parts of Eastern Europe and the American South, people still tell of vanishing bridges, old wooden spans repaired by locals, only to collapse again days later. Survivors claim they saw figures waiting at the far end, shadowy forms, silent processions, pale lights hovering above the path. These visions disappear once the bridge falls again, as though the collapse itself is the only barrier keeping them away. Archaeology sometimes confirms the ritual logic. A recently studied site in Anatolia revealed a stone bridge that had been intentionally buried under tons of earth. No flood caused its ruin. It was entombed deliberately. Why? The absence of nearby settlements suggests it was not abandoned for economic reasons. The leading theory, the bridge connected to sacred space, sealed once the rituals tied to it ended. To reopen would be to undo the closure of a ceremony millennia old. But perhaps the most chilling answer is not monsters or ghosts, but ourselves. What waits on the other side may be what we left behind: rituals, bargains, debts unpaid. Reopening is a reminder. The bridge stands as ledger, keeping account of what was promised and forgotten. To cross again is to face the balance due, the toll still waiting after centuries. What waits is not alien, but our own obligations, grown heavier with time. So, if the bridges reopen, what happens? Maybe we rediscover roads once lost. Maybe we reconnect with lands once cut off. Or maybe we awaken truth sealed for a reason. The other side is not just geography, it is memory, myth, and the shadows of all we tried to leave behind. What waits there is not neutral. It is watching, patient, waiting for the moment stone meets stone again. And perhaps the darkest thought of all, maybe the other side has been waiting for us to rebuild. Maybe the collapse was never final, only temporary, a pause in a conversation not yet finished. To reopen is to answer a call, one we may regret hearing, for thresholds do not open one way. When we cross to them, they also cross to us, and what waits may not wait forever.